So this session is on From Policies to Practice, Solutions to Strengthen Global to Local Drought Risk Management. So of course we're in Nebraska, we need to talk about drought because of the importance and the influence of the National Drought Mitigation Center. But we know it's bigger than that. There are many ideas that we have to bring in. So we will see numbers and pictures in our news feeds. 55 million people are impacted by drought. We look at how those prolonged drought impacts are across people, health, environment, economies, livelihoods, the very fundamental being of so many people. But this session is all about what are the practical solutions? What can we do? There's no point just saying, yes, there's all these disasters. What are we going to do and how are we going to respond to that? My name is Rachel McDonnell, and I'm the Deputy Director General at the International Water Management Institute. And it's been my great pleasure to work with the team here at Nebraska and all my colleagues here for a long period of time. And I'm delighted to be moderating this session today. So in 2013, the World Meteorological Organization, the Secretariat of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, with other key international regional organizations, international organizations, met at something called the High-Level Meeting on National Drought Policy, HMNDP. And for anybody who's been working in drought since 2013, you will know that it's the go-to website, it's the go-to framework that anybody working on drought. From the work that was at Nebraska from Don Wilhite, that took the thinking of 3 pillars into HMNDP and into the Integrated Drought Risk Management Program. And that's what we all use on a day-to-day basis. So those 3 pillars of drought risk management: drought early warning systems, vulnerability and impact assessment, and then mitigation, preparedness, and response. If you think about it, if we bring those 3 things together, we can understand, we can see where the drought is, the intensity, we can understand from past droughts who's most impacted, and we can design policies, practices, mitigation techniques to be able to deal with and then get past those droughts. So those 3 pillars are something that we all use. But it's an important year. It's HMNDP plus 10. It's 10 years since those pillars became embodied. So part of what we're doing today is a process that will lead through to a major drought conference that will be held early in 2024, where we look at that integrated drought risk management plan. What's worked, what hasn't worked, what do we need to do for the next decade of drought risk management? And my goodness, don't we need it? We see, though, the increasing intensity and frequency in drought. So what we want in this session is we're going to present a series of insights from global level through to national level, through to regional level, national level, through to critical areas like finance, and then local groundwater management. So we're looking at drought and drought risk management across a number of different scales. And I'm delighted to have with us on the panel. I'm not going to give a lot of details, but please look at their bio. We have Daniel Segai from UNCCD, Mark Svoboda from the National Drought Mitigation Center here in Nebraska. We have Marcus Enenkel from the Disaster Risk Financing team at the World Bank, and Renata Rimichet, who's at Doughty Water for Food. So you can see that we're bringing all sorts of experiences into the discussion. We're going to have 8-minute presentations to begin with. And at the end of each 8-minute presentation, there will be a time for a few questions, if you want, to that speaker. We'll then, at the end of all of that, we'll open it up to much bigger conversations. We want your questions and your feedback on your experiences of drought. What are some of the questions you'd like to ask the presenters here? But also, what is it you need to tell us? Or if you're not going to be at that HMNDP plus 10, what can we take from your experiences into the conversations, into the discussions that we're going to be doing to frame the next 10 years of drought risk management? So that's the session today. We want it to be interactive. We want your inputs. So please do feel that you're part of this conversation. And we do have online participants who will also be adding to that. So I'm going to ask to start. Daniel, could you begin us by giving us a global view of it?
Thank you very much, Rachel, for this kind introduction and nice introduction of what we are doing so far. And I'm very much delighted today to be with you and to discuss drought. Whenever it comes to drought, I have been working on this issue for the last 10 years, and I'm very much passionate about it because when it comes to this topic, I grew up in Eritrea where drought personally has some relationship with me. So I'm very much interested to discuss this issue, and I'm also here to work with you on this. The first slide, please. This is it. Okay. But still. Okay, global efforts to address drought risk, perspectives from the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. I am a program management officer at the UNCCD. UNCCD is one of the 3 Rio conventions. One of the other Rio conventions is climate change. The other one is biodiversity. And we are a desertification convention. And I will talk a bit about the UNCCD also towards the end of my presentation. Okay, drought, you all know, it's a global and it's also an urgent issue. And within the next 80 years, 129 countries will experience an increase in drought exposure, mainly due to climate change alone. And this is from the UNDRR special report on drought and also other reports. And the direct and indirect impacts of drought across society, economy, and ecosystems are often difficult to quantify. I was reading a report from the World Bank where it says children born during drought times are like 3 times more likely to be stunted in terms of their cognitive development across years. So we don't see it. The water quality aspect of it, the indirect impacts of drought, even when rainfall comes back. We don't see it, and its long-term indirect impacts are not accounted for. So whenever we talk about impacts of drought, we need to make sure that there is a lot that we don't know much about the impacts. So the damage and costs are resulting from drought are usually they are hidden, as I said, and they are due to widespread and cascading impacts. They are also often invisible. They're affecting everybody's life of people, not always attributed to the drought. So we don't attribute it to drought, but there are a lot of hidden impacts of drought. So drought, yes, it is deadly. More than 10 million people lost their lives due to major drought events in the past century. And it's also devastating. We can measure it in a number of measures. We had just one publication on drought in numbers that was published in May 2022, and it has a lot of the numbers that we see how drought is affecting. And plants affected by drought has more than doubled in the last 40 years, for example. And it is also costly. It has some economic sense. For example, from 1998 to 2017, in 20 years, drought has impacted about $125 billion losses as a result of drought, and the numbers are also rising. By 2050, 3 in 4 people will live in drought situations. So the numbers tell us that this situation is going to get worsen. And 55 million people, I think already Rachel mentioned, globally are directly affected by drought every year. So these numbers are not meant to threaten anyone, but at least to make sure that this is an issue, and it's a serious issue that we are discussing. From our drought in numbers publication from last year, for example, as you can see, Western United States, the past 2 decades have been the driest in 1,200 years. And the mega drought in Chile in its 13th consecutive year, as you know it already. And Europe had also faced its severe worst decades in 500 years. And Horn of Africa, it's always impacted by drought, but the last droughts were very, very severe. I think the Horn of Africa is now entering its 6th consecutive year of drought, and Australia. So it is impacting everyone and everywhere. So from problems to solutions, what should we do about it? Drought resilience, it is multi-sectoral, it's impacting us all, and we need a collaborative approach. No sector alone can do it, or no country can alone do it. We have to make sure that this is going to be tackled in a more collaborative approach. The consequence of the recent drought events in 2022, they teach us a lesson that this is meant to be for everyone, and we have to face it globally. It is more urgent than ever to proactively tackle the root of cause of drought, and so that we can build resilience across sectors and also ecological systems. So proactive planning across sectors within countries is very essential, but international collaboration is also needed to effectively manage drought. So we need to make sure that there is some kind of exchange of experience and knowledge from north to the south, but also triangulation from south to the south. So we need to make sure that there is some exchange of knowledge and experience from countries to countries, and collaborative arrangements are needed to anticipate and to respond to drought quickly, so that we can at least reduce the scale of impacts of droughts. So I think this has also been mentioned. The paradigm shift that we are working on is from reactive to proactive approach. We need to make sure that usually the reactive approach, as you can see, the red part of this map is that you respond to drought. As with the result of an emergency relief, you assess the impact, you recover, and you restore, and that's where the story ends. But we need to complete the cycle. Some say it a hydroillogical cycle, where you just stop with the reactive approach. What we need to work in non-drought times. We need to work on drought in non-drought times. That means trying to also work on monitoring and early warning, and assessing the vulnerability, who is going to be vulnerable and why, like the drought risk profiling and risk mitigation measures. What are my options in terms of drought risk mitigation measures? So we're trying to support countries to ensure that they are working in non-drought times, making sure that they have a kind of a national drought risk management commission, for example, that is going to be meeting every time, so that they can also have a chain of command. What is going to happen, who is going to act on what, when drought strikes. Then we don't treat drought as a crisis, but as a risk. But I wanted to add that there is some recent discussion. Reactive to proactive is also not enough. We need to go into a more prospective approach. We need to ensure that drought is part and parcel of our policy. So drought decisions at COP15, as you know, UNCCD has a COP15 in May 2022, and countries were tasked to an intergovernmental working group on drought. They were asked to identify and evaluate all options. So all countries in every region have 3 representatives, and they are meeting every 3 months to discuss how can we manage drought sustainably under the UNCCD. We need policy instruments. We need new ways of tackling drought, whether it is legal or non-legal binding measures, whether it is a drought financing option, it can be a global drought trust fund, it can be a non-legally binding option, but we need policy instruments in order to mitigate impacts of drought. And we are also supporting countries to develop national drought plans. And I think the first to foster also high-level meeting on national drought policy, I think Rachel has already mentioned about it. It's going to happen in early 2024. Another new thing I'm going to finish with this is the UNCCD is supporting the government of Spain and Senegal to work on a global drought alliance, an international drought resilience alliance that is spearheaded by the government of Spain and Senegal. As I said, drought is not anywhere to go. We are supposed to adapt to it, and countries at the head of states level are now working on an international drought resilience alliance. It was launched during the COP27 in Egypt, and it is a collaborative platform which aims to catalyze political momentum and action to support countries. We are also linking into catalyzing consolidation of regional initiatives and to promote full engagement of stakeholders, including the private sector, and to facilitate knowledge sharing and networking. So these are the number of countries that are so far members of this alliance. We have UN entities, we have multilateral development banks and financial facilities, and intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations also part of this. And it is still open for every other, whether it's a country or any entity or NGO to join. We have a platform to do this, and it is possible for anyone to join this alliance. So in terms of this alliance, what is it going to do? First, it's going to build political momentum for the agenda, and to common framework to accelerate action on drought resilience. We need to have a common framework, because drought risks are different in different countries and different contexts. And we need to build a knowledge transfer and exchange of experience, because at least in terms of the hypothesis, the solutions are there. We know the knowledge, we know the technology, but we need to upscale it, we need to make it sure that it is available to others. And innovative finance for drought resilience. These are the 4 pillars that are driving action on this alliance. The roadmap is, we launched it in November 2022, and we are hoping to have some results at COP 2016, that is December 2024. So these are the countries. As I said, it's just a picture that they took in COP 27. So UNCCD is a global vision for the voice of land. Just to speak just maybe 30 seconds on the UNCCD. It's a convention that is adopted in 1994. It entered into force in 1996. About 197 are parties to the convention. And it's about life. Land is life, and our lives depend on land. So we are a land convention, while we have also a climate convention and a biodiversity convention, one of the 3 Rio conventions. And I'm not going to speak about this, but at least impacts of land degradation are also discussed, and we are a custodian of land degradation neutrality of SDG 15.3 about the UNCCD. We are trying to support countries to commit for a land degradation neutral world by 2030. So we have 130 nations now. They have voluntarily targets. They have already joined the target setting program. 130 countries have committed to become a land degradation neutral country by 2030. Thank you.
So Daniel's given us an insight on COP movements, the COP15, the IDRA, the HMNDP. So we can see that UN and intergovernmental and international organizations are looking to catalyze change, exchange views, bring in actions and developments that will help countries manage drought. Are there any questions you would like to ask Daniel? So I'm going to repeat the question so that our online guests can be part of that. So you're asking, is there at a UN level, so is there any convention that deals with addressing national disaster?
Yeah, I think the second question is also about supporting policies to implement the agreements. Okay, for your first question about a convention that deals with disasters, UNCCD is a convention that deals with drought disaster. We have a climate change. Climate change itself is also another disaster, and biodiversity. But we have also a UNDRR, United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction. It is also a mechanism on all disasters that is trying to support countries to implement the Sendai framework for implementation. Sendai framework was agreed in 2015, and it deals with all disasters. And we are also part of this mechanism where we try to also support them with the drought aspect. So UNDRR is at least there to support countries to do this. In terms of supporting policy to implementation, we keep saying that the UN is there to facilitate action for the countries. We are meant to support them, but the implementation on the ground that will make a lasting change is going to be done by the sovereign countries, by the countries themselves. But we can facilitate. There should be some kind of action that we can do. Capacity development is one. Trying to also promote some kind of innovative financing options where countries can put some kind of mobilizing resources, trying to support countries to have a grant proposal, for example, at the UNCCD, we try to support them to come up with a transformative project. And that can go to the Global Climate Fund, and they can get a project. So I think in the end, it's always good to assume that the final change comes from the countries. And we always say that participation is ownership. If you own your problem, then you own the solution as well. So it's always good to see that countries are finally the ones who are going to be the change makers in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on my Google, I know one of the websites that I most send colleagues when we work in countries is IDMP. There is so many documents and insights and the 10 steps and all of that. So there is a lot to support policy development processes online through the whole process around IDMP. Yeah. But she knows the IDMP. Well, that's perfect then. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much for that. So we've looked at the global processes and the global convention, what is there to support countries as they do that. But what we know is that early warning systems is one of those critical parts of it all. We need to make sure that those early warning systems captures the drought, the onset as well as the offset of the drought in an accurate way, because decisions, money, budgets, all sorts of decisions are going to be based on those drought monitoring. And who better to give us insight of that is Mark Svoboda.
Thank you, Rachel. So well said. Almost do my talk for me, I think. All right, so let's talk about, as Rachel alluded to, I think, obviously the three pillars she mentioned, probably perhaps the most visible that people can relate to is drought early warning, because they see the maps. And, you know, we're going to talk about some of that other stuff, but let's focus, just for those that are in the room, there's a lot of new faces. Just real quickly, who are we? The Drought Mitigation Center. We've been around since 1995. And you know, many of you from other countries, Dr. Wilhite globally is known for starting this crusade back in the late 70s and into the 80s of proactive drought risk management and the hydrological cycle that was alluded to by Daniel. So a lot of these doctrines have come down over time, the 10-step process distilled into the three pillars. So the Drought Mitigation Center, there is a strong coincidence, obviously, to those three green circles on the left. Those are the three pillars. In essence, that's our mission. Our job as a boundary organization is to translate science to policy, to the public, and to our peers. And in doing so, to hopefully make it not just useful, but usable, something they can actually use in their decision and policy making. So I won't need to spend time on this. I think we've already addressed the three pillars, but I'll focus on the top left one there, monitoring and early warning. What do we mean by drought early warning? I think it's important that, you know, a word that should be in here is actually the word I use more often here is drought early warning, information systems. Again, distilled information, packaging out to decision makers and policymakers in the format that they need that's usable. Also developing triggers. We're going to talk, I'll show a slide later on about what do we mean by triggers. The drought early warning system should hopefully provide triggers to those decision and policymakers so that they can use it in their day-to-day jobs. So the other last key point I'll make on this slide is that when I say early warning, most people assume we're just talking about forecasting or seasonal outlooks. And in reality, drought is much more about both monitoring and early and forecasting, not just forecasting. We need the diligent day-to-day monitoring efforts to watch how drought comes in. And at the end here, I'm going to talk about, I think the old doctrine is only that droughts are always really slow to develop. They take months or years. And in fact, with warming climate, you know, I think this term flash drought, if you've heard about that, I'm going to talk about that at the very end of my talk a little bit. So that monitoring system, I think what's important there is that, yeah, drought's driving it, but look at if you know that machine where it hits the ball and then they kind of oscillate, look at all the impacts on the right side here. This is what's impacted by drought. It cross-cutting across many sectors, and we're trying to capture an early warning system. If we're starting from scratch, we want to make sure impacts are held up as high in regard to collection as precipitation, temperature, surface and groundwater, et cetera. So it's not just the physical environmental parameters, but also the socioeconomic parameters, including ecological, et cetera. So I think that's very important to emphasize that part of the, not just the hydrologic cycle, but also what's happening on the ground impact-wise. So an example of how this has permeated through early warning systems, this product developed in the late 90s, sort of classified drought into percentiles, which allowed us to compare different parameters that have different periods of record, different units, and allowed us to generate maps like this. So the U.S. Drought Monitor, again, has been around since '99, coming up on our 25th anniversary next year, as our state of the science. And the process we follow is a convergence of evidence process. So not one indicator typically tells the whole story. And in fact, when we're informing and trying to give a decision maker, they don't want to look at 20 maps, right? Or 12 maps. They want to look at one map, typically. But how do you present something so complex as drought into one map? It's a real challenge. But one way we do that, in order to not cry wolf too early, or to say you're in drought before you're in it, or to say you're out of it before you're out of it, is to look at multiple indicators in a multivariate approach. This is what determines our approach to drought monitoring. Isn't just that this one indicator does it all for everything, but rather several indicators. We start to see consensus and majority, we feel more confident in our drought depiction. Here's an example of work we've done with the World Bank in Zimbabwe. Notice the three maps here. Again, these systems can be very simple or very robust. They might have just a couple of indicators. They might have half a dozen or a dozen indicators. But the principle's the same. You'll notice that each of the individual inputs tells its own story. But together, when they start to converge, you feel a much stronger story coming out to believe that there's impacts. And we will see what to expect, or maybe to expect on the ground in terms of impacts. That's why we need diligent impact monitoring, which is a whole nother story. So we blend these together and we look at the percentile rankings and we come up with that final map on the far right. We can run this for a variety of countries or regions, and the inputs can vary for each country, and even actually within the country in different regions within the country. So it's a very flexible system. The way we do that is what we call these composite drought indicators. Again, what data are available to us operationally that we can rely on each week, each month, each day? Typically, these are, weekly to monthly. And then we bring these in and we run them into this historical context or percentiles. And that allows us to provide that convergence of evidence. Then we can use expert judgment or machine learning to determine the weighting. The weighting is important. Machine learning helps us do that, but expert judgment is very important. Which ones go into it in the first place. So these are some of the techniques we do to produce that map, like what I showed you for Zimbabwe. But they take on many shapes and colors, and these are just examples of the other groups we've worked with around the world at the Drought Center over the years. Brazil was also a World Bank project. Got to work with Rachel and her team on the Middle East, North Africa, or MENA region. Did a fully gridded composite approach in Australia with their drought center in southern Queensland, and then most recently with the World Bank again in the SADC region of South Africa. Another good example of actual applications. This was just to inform those decision and policymakers on the ground, in this case in Southern Africa. What is a CDI? Try to translate that in very simple infographics. And then on the right, we've seen actual applications already where, in the case of Eswatini, they've brought it down to an agricultural bulletin that goes out to their producers and their chiefdoms, these regions like a group of counties or chiefdoms, more provincial level, that is then disseminated out to their producers. And then on the top there, we've worked with Tanzania and others on how they would implement a CDI into their government or into their governance policies. So it takes on a little different form in each country. It's got to be very much tailored. It's not a blueprint that's one size fits all. You really have to work with the people on the ground to make sure, again, that it's usable. All right, so just a couple more slides on science to policy, and then I want to wrap up with flash drought. So really that long title I had at the beginning, which I didn't even bother reading, really should just say, now what? And that's kind of, I think, what Rachel was alluding to. Our intent here was to show what we were doing and what are the applications on the ground. So ultimately, to be usable, how do we get these products in front of the right people, the decision makers and the policymakers, and make sure that they'll use it and that it works? So there's a lot of validation that goes on. There's no other way to say this, but it takes time. You have to spend time, you have to build trust, build transparency, rub elbows, and it just takes time. There's no quick fix to some of this. And if you want buy-in from them later on in ownership, it's their product. They know that. They have to have that. It's just critical. So we're just trying to get this process into policy and decision maker hands. So speaking of triggers, you've got your indicators. That could be a CDI, but it could be an individual indicator like a reservoir or groundwater. That's what's in the middle there is a particular index. And then a trigger could be set up to these different declaration categories that are typically customized to an individual company or a community or even a country. All right, so 2 slides left. I want to talk about the old doctrine. I kind of mentioned up front as a tease, flash drought, because I believe flash drought can prove to be one way we can get on the right timeline or horizon, which are often very much shorter for political types because they're only in office for so long, that they should prepare and plan for drought. Now, it doesn't mean they don't last months or years, because they do, or decades. They last days to decades. So if you look at this chart here, that flash on the left is sort of a newer concept. Not that flash droughts haven't been around, but with climate change and a warming climate, speeding up the water going through the water cycle, evapotranspiration increase, and then demand side, which is the vulnerability side, going up. This is bringing on droughts in a more rapid nature. So by flash drought, we mean rapid onset or rapid intensification events. And I think this might be a way to get this in front of emergency managers and other decision policymakers that typically thought, drought, I've got months, maybe years to worry about it. But we want them to start thinking about it today because it can come on very quickly. And this schematic, this is actually, Molly's actually in the room for NIDIS, was in another session, but we worked on a schematic to show this DEWS sort of drought early warning information system sort of process. And through the core there, notice the scale from a very broad scale at the top, national, down to a very local scale, which is what this panel represents, I think, ironically as well. And how that flash droughts require more rapid response than your traditional droughts. So having an informative drought early warning system in place is going to help address that drought in a more timely fashion, which hopefully will mitigate the impacts that will come later on. So my last slide is about this cycle. I've worked with years with Dr. Hayes over here, the former director of the Drought Center. And what we have seen in working with these groups and groups like Rachel's team and others over the years is that as we've improved the drought early warning information system, and that's informed some additional planning and policy sort of efforts or mitigation efforts, that then that circle requires an even more detailed, informative early warning system. So you get the cycle going that feeds on itself, if you will. And that's a good thing because it shows it's being used and it's being adapted and being customized for that particular user. So with that, I will close and take a question if we have time, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark. I always feel very privileged to hear the latest experiences, insights, and innovation from the National Drought Mitigation Center in Nebraska. It's always a treat. Are there any questions for Mark? I'll take yours and then yours.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your presentation. One thing that I do notice was that when you do have these triggers and you see there are triggers that are coming in, what are you then going to do? That's something that I did not quite understand. What's your next step after the triggers?
Do you want to paraphrase that question?
So your question is, the drought map's shown there's a drought, it's stage 1 or stage 2, and then what happens? What does it trigger?
There's a trigger, yeah, and then what do you do next?
No, that's an awesome question. Except I had 8 minutes to cover 3 topics, and there should be 5. And the 5th would be, now what? I should have done a better job of that. So those triggers will enact action in a plan, ideally. A drought plan or a multi-hazard plan, a water plan, a climate adaptation plan. We advocate for any piece of such a planning process, have drought as part of that process. So who's accountable to do what, and when do they do it, is triggered on a threshold. This group's going to meet and do this and take care of these issues, but everyone knows who's supposed to do what and when they do it, instead of just crisis mode, ad hoc, fly by the seat of your pants. We want to avoid that. We want to be proactive. So drought planning is a short answer.
And I'm going to talk about that in a minute.
Okay, and Rachel's going to actually, we did think about that. Okay, like I said, I could only talk about a few of the topics, so.
Your question, sir?
Question maybe on a common theme that was mentioned in both presentations, which is the need for greater collaboration and cooperation between sectors. And you mentioned the interconnectedness between droughts and water, agriculture, and tourism, and the need to bring different people to the table. From the experiences you shared from the different case studies, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on some of the key barriers that you've identified for lack of proper communication or collaboration between these different players, sectors. Is it more institutional? Is it capacity related? Is there a challenge in communicating across different sectors with different languages, with different jargon, different terminology? What would you say are the top 3 challenges or barriers that are not allowing us to communicate, collaborate at a level that is consistent with how interconnected all of these sectors and challenges are?
So thank you for the question, and it was about highlighting that the 2 speakers have shown how multi-sectoral, how multi-ministerial drought is. And so it's all about what market have you seen as the barriers for getting past those silos and getting past those different frames of references for drought.
Another very good question that you're right. Pragmatically, we see in working on the ground with these countries, its answer is E, all of the above, can be impediments or barriers. You know, I'd add in there some politics. You're right, that comes into the institutional side of this as far as ownership, typically, where we've seen, and if you noticed on the drought monitor map, and I didn't go into it, we put all the partners on the map that are actually contributing to it to give the attribution so that there is more ownership, to build trust, to build transparency. If it's just one group, typically one stakeholder group that runs that process, then there can be some lack of trust that, oh, that's their product, they've got their agenda. We're not a part of making that map or that early warning system. Why should I collaborate? So building the trust and transparency to me are really fundamental cores. But then all the other things you mentioned are very, very relevant. Communication, politics, et cetera. So it's very well said. And each country is different on how they operate in that environment. And so typically, again, when it's in the middle of a hot drought, it's the worst time to be dealing with it and planning for it because it's just crisis response. The good time is to bring all this as many stakeholders, and not just at the national level, the NGOs at the local level, to the table when you're discussing such a plan, so that there's inclusion and voice and transparency and trust. He wants to know if you can follow up.
I think we are really, so please hold that question because we will open it up for a much bigger discussion in a minute, and we absolutely want to do. So the next talk is by me. So I'm Rachel McDonnell, and I want to share some of the experiences we have of that Middle East, North Africa project that Mark spoke about. This is a collaboration between the National Drought Mitigation Center, the International Water Management Institute, Doughty Water for Food. But it also, I wanted to include this because it then answers your question and what happens next. Oh, yes, I got it. So we have talked about the 3 pillars of drought management, and there they are on the right-hand side. The monitoring early warning system that Mark has just given us insight on. That middle one is about vulnerability and impact assessment. This is where we go back and go through all the data, all the records, have focus groups, and say, last time when that drought was there, Who got impacted the most? How much did they get impacted the most? Was it the herders? Was it the irrigated farmers? Was it those living in urban areas where they're having to pay so much money for tankers of water? That capturing what has been the last impacts of the last droughts and why are particular groups vulnerable is really critical. So that's pillar 2. Pillar 3 is what I want to talk about. It's then how do we then bring together the drought early warning systems, understanding which sectors, which people are most impacted, to then come up with drought action plans so that we can be targeted, focused, really addressing drought in this particular local context. And the countries we worked in were Jordan, Morocco, and Lebanon. And as those shots, those newspaper articles showed, all of those countries have been impacted by droughts as we were doing this project. So it was from 2015 to the end of 2023, and USAID funded it. It was in 2 tranches, but what is critical, and I'm very grateful for, is that USAID understood it takes a long time to build all these processes. Yes, we can build the drought monitoring system relatively quickly, particularly if you have your friends from Nebraska come and help you. But it's what then happens, it's the engagement, it's the continual areas. So it's been 8-9 years of funding. So this is highlighting those first 2 pillars. You can see those drought maps at the onset of drought in Morocco, and they're now in their 4th year of there. And you can see those 2 reports. That's just giving you an impact, an insight on the vulnerability and impact assessment reports. And in all 3 countries, it was the first time there was a comprehensive integrated assessment of those reports. All of this has been available online, and agencies like World Food Programme and that are now using those. So then what comes next? Well, this begins to answer the question you just asked about intersectionality and all the different people that we were. In all 3 countries, we worked through the key ministries, but we also made sure that the drought technical committees included many different ministries, many different stakeholders who would be part of not only addressing but also responding to droughts. So ministries of agriculture, of course, but water and economics and environment and health. The National Meteorological Agencies, these are often critical groups of people with capabilities for setting up those drought monitoring systems. But we're also dealing with NGOs and farmer user group and river basin authorities, and also often the National Center for Crisis Management, because it's a different center that often comes in when there is a hazard coming into place, and those people are not necessarily experts in drought. In Lebanon, for example, they're expert at dealing with missiles and military action. They're not used to handling drought. And so it's a case of bringing everybody into the room, and by having those technical committees, it is them that we worked with patiently over 2 years that included COVID and Zoom calls and everything like that to develop these national drought plans. So what's the policy objectives when you're developing drought policy? And you've got to think about what are the objectives of the governments as you're dealing with drought policy. Well, food security is a number 1 issue. It's national food and water security. So we've got to make sure that in any action plans we are addressing that. How will a country be able to respond to that? But it's also about livestock, herd sizes, and the output value of staple crops. In the region we work in, wheat is really critical. So that's very important. In any policy we have, we've got to make sure we're putting in measures to be able to manage that wheat production. Things like credit, access to credit. Farmers have loans. What can we do to reschedule those loans? What can we do to reschedule the financing? All of this has to come into the thinking. And looking at intersectoral water allocation. What we know in many of the countries we worked with, that as soon as we get into a stage 1 drought, that triggers. Often it's the water to agriculture, to irrigation that is turned off. So if we understand what is the current water allocation, we then need to make sure that then comes into our drought action plans. And you can see some of the responses that are still in place at the moment. This was Morocco. They pledged $1 billion to deal with their drought. Well, what we would hope is through proactive drought planning, we can bring that down. So this is the work on the Jordan National Drought Action Plan. So this, as you can see, lots of conversations across ministries, breaking down the jargon, breaking down the vested interests, and then agreeing what would each ministry do. What would that drought monitoring trigger? Will it trigger adverts in newspapers, on social media? What are the types of actions? I'm sure you are very aware of the types of policy actions. There are information instruments, there's economic instruments, there's regulatory instruments. What will they trigger? And it's sitting down and agreeing, when we have this take place, what will your ministry do? What will my ministry do? And agreeing that and putting that all together in a drought action plan. So this is the first National Drought Action Plan in there. And this is the sort of structure that we had in our drought action plans. So we look at the priority impacts. In your country, which are the sectors that are the biggest one? We can't cover all sectors. So you give me your top 5 sectors, and of course that vulnerability and impact assessment plan helps do that. So we had, for Jordan, we had 10, 12 sectors impacted. We took the top 5. We didn't deal with forest fires. We didn't deal with some other aspects. We took the ones that had the most economic and social impact. We then look at what are the preparedness. Is it an information, is it media responses, putting it into the newspapers? What are the actions? But also critically, what are the mitigation actions that can be taken? Because what we want to do is we want to make sure Jordan is better set up for when the next drought comes. So is it drought-tolerant seeds? Is it different irrigation systems? So not only do we have actions that are triggered by the drought maps, we also have mitigation actions. And that's forward thinking, looking at what we could possibly do. There's looking at the governance framework. So who actually has responsibility for it? Who has the ultimate role in this governance framework in your country to say there is a drought, to declare drought? Because very few governments actually want to declare drought. It has so many different implications. In Jordan, it's the Ministry of Agriculture, but there's tensions with other ministries that the ultimate declaration of drought is made through that. So we need to look at the governance system, and that goes into the drought action plans. We then we had to agree the drought definitions, and this links through to the maps, but the maps we can change. In Jordan, what they wanted was that the first drought trigger was sort of quite a way down the line, because it's a naturally arid country. So agreeing those triggers and then the return on those droughts, what those numbers were for those droughts, was something that were negotiated and that we were able to do. And then looking at those drought response action plans, but also looking at the monitoring of what has been effective as you install those drought action plans. So a review, so the best time for this is when it's raining outside. You're able to go back with a cool head and just say, actually, those adverts on the newspapers didn't work, those Facebook things didn't work, cutting it off to the farmers, actually we did it too early, too late, whatever it is. So this is what we put into that drought action plan structure. So what are the sort of challenges being faced by agencies as we're developing these drought action plans, as we're sitting in the room? First of all, it's the science to policy interface. Now, I've had many years of experience of listening to Mark and his team, and I can sort of understand how those drought maps are generated. But, you know, not everybody can do, and we're asking people to trust those maps. So it's understanding the science that underpins a lot of what we bring into those drought action plans, and being able to negotiate across that science to policy interface to bring trust, to be able to then take those inputs into the drought action plan. Because in the end, I'm not going to be in Jordan implementing it, nor is Mark. We have to make sure our middle level government agent officers, but also our ministers and the Secretary Generals need to trust what's gone into that there. One of the problems is the trade-offs, and this is very difficult to be able to negotiate, and this is why it takes 2.5, 3 years of negotiations of monthly or weekly calls and sharing of documents and rewriting documents and changing words in a document to be able to break down some of those issues. And of course, you will know it's the political economy. Who's the most powerful agent? Who's the most powerful minister? Who's got connections to the big farmers or the tribal leaders or whatever it is? Navigating the political economy can make it very difficult. So what's the role of an organization like IMI or NDMC? These boundary organizations, what do we do and how is it good to work to bring the knowledge and experience we have into that? Well, as we're working in the MENA region, it was just going with the grain. There is a whole set of processes. We're not coming into this new. There's been 500 years of managing droughts there. So it's really looking at where we're at and just making incremental, slow changes, going with what's already in place. So it's very much looking at that going and our work is to advise and to guide and bring experiences. And I remember in October 2018, we had a meeting with Nebraska, with the decision makers in Jordan. And one of the things they wanted us, we printed out lots of drought management plans from different states in the US. It's from very complicated through to simple. So it's that bringing that knowledge and that experience and understanding into the conversations for the people we work with to then put it into their own context. And things like that, encouraging and facilitating, and you being the one that drives the meeting. Yes, we're having a meeting this month, and there's going to be one next month, and yes, we'll bring the pizza, and yes, we'll book the room, and yes, we do everything like that, to keep the momentum of the process going, because it takes it's a big marathon to get that drought action plan put into place. So what I wanted to do was share some of the experiences that we've had in the MENA region of bringing in drought action plans that are now there. We have 3 drought action plans linked to drought monitoring systems that is taking us 8-9 years to deliver for those countries that are being most impacted. So thank you very much for your attention. So I'd love to answer any questions you might have on that. Please.
I need to ask about, since you have mentioned the economic impacts and you have mentioned about the health as well. So do you check for the quality adjusted life years? Like if yes, so what does it signify in your study?
So what we did was we tried to get as much health data as possible, and that included stunting data that Daniel referred to. It's sometimes quite difficult to have cause and effect because there's often many other factors in there. One of the simplest ones was in the Jordan Valley. We could look at outbreak of gastroenteritis because we now had you had wastewater, sewage water there that was now being used, and that brought all sorts of differences on health. Here in Nebraska, there's Jesse Bell, who is a leading expert on water. So he's not here, but there's a whole area around health that is often poorly understood. It's something that we all need to be working on as researchers, but also trying to get the data. That's another one of those data sets we need to bring into Pillar 2 about vulnerability and impact assessment. And then, in Pillar 3, in that drought action plan, what can the health authorities, can they justify budgets to be able to deal with some of those issues that we can show that comes into? So their responses can be part of those drought action plans, those triggers. So thank you very much for that. And now I'm going to ask Marcus Enenkel from the World Bank, who works on disaster risk finance. Finance is so critical in being able to help those affected respond. So over to you, Marcus.
Thank you. Where's the clicky thing? That's the clicky thing, right?
Yeah.
Does anyone speak German here? Or understand German? So there's a word in German that's called Fachtrottel. Fach means subject and Trottel is an idiot. That's me. When you said what actually happens with the triggers, I realized that I had no slide explaining what drought risk finance actually is, right? So, just to kick this off, talking about reactive and proactive ways of dealing with drought from a financial perspective. You could, of course, rely on indemnity-based insurance, wait until droughts kill all your crops, evaluators are sent out, you have to wait for your payout. That's basically it. That works. Right? If you have 1,000 hectares, that's what many high-income countries do. Most of the people that I've been working with have half a hectare or 1 hectare, which means that, first of all, they cannot afford to wait many months until the payouts arrive. but it would be extremely expensive to pay the evaluators, which increases the premium, and that's just terrible, right? So, I called this the last chapter, right? And I tried to summarize what I actually mean with this. We will not be able to set any risk for any hazard to zero, and that needs to be very, very clear, right? So dealing with the issue of drought risk requires owning the risk, owning the data, really a buy-in from decision makers and stakeholders, and on different levels. We talk a lot about risk-informed decision making. I think there's a lot of potential, particularly in Earth observation, when it comes to risk-informed decision-making. But recent studies showed that the use of Earth observation data for impact assessments after disaster struck is a lot higher than for actual risk assessments, right? So there's a lot of potential. And the secret for me personally, when it comes to risk financing, is to start off the process of designing a risk finance product independently from the scale, from the spatial scale, with an actual co-design, asking people what they really need, what they really want, what they're concerned about, creating an atmosphere where people are not afraid of speaking up and saying, I have no idea what you just said. I have no idea what this acronym means, and I don't want this because someone else was just there from another country, from another organization that tried to sell me the same story, right? So we need to create this atmosphere where people are not afraid of speaking up. So I structured this as where we were, where we are, and where we could be or should be. In 2011, on the 19th of July, famine was declared in East Africa, in Somalia. And it was sort of the sign to act. Really, something needed to happen because famine was declared. At the time that famine was declared, half of the people that would ultimately die had already died, right? So from the perspective of risk finance, what happened between 2010 and I think 2019 or 20, there was a huge temporal gap, a huge delay between realizing that something was happening, that a critical drought level had been reached, and payouts reaching governments. And I couldn't actually believe the number, but it was on average 1 year. And we tended to realize that there's a lot of added value in understanding the moisture anomalies and how they translate into vegetation greenness anomalies. But of course, there's a lot happening in between, right? Sometimes you see that the vegetation greenness isn't the way it should be, although there was no rainfall deficit, so something needs to happen in between. What about evapotranspiration? What about temperature? What about soil moisture? What about roots on soil moisture? That's basically exactly what the CDI is doing, right? Combining different independent variables into a convergence of evidence logic to really understand where the gaps are, where the critical points are that we need to understand. So that's where we were. Okay, so where are we? We have established a system that allows us to run risk finance schemes at different spatial scales, and it's called the risk layering approach, right? So droughts can have different return periods, and you need different tools and different instruments to deal with different return periods. One big issue that I see is that we're so much focused on statistical tail events, right? The most extreme droughts, the ones that make it into the New York Times, that we completely ignore the consecutive non-extreme droughts. Convergence of evidence, again, I think that's one of the most critical issues from the drought hazard perspective. That does not solve the issue of understanding what the droughts actually cause. And that's one of the questions that I get the most frequently at the World Bank. Senior managers at the World Bank want to know how many people are actually affected. Like what does it cost us to deal with the drought in a certain region? And as good as the hazard data have become, and we talk about data from geospatial satellites that update information about an entire hemisphere every 15 minutes, the socioeconomic baseline is just not there. Some of the food insecurity data are updated every few months, once, twice a year, right? So how can you talk about super sophisticated machine learning AI-driven processes if the hazard data don't match with the socioeconomic data in spatial or temporal resolution? So where could we be, or where should we be? Some of the issues that I'm facing in my daily work are not super fancy science questions, right? Some of the questions that I get are, I cannot open this file, right? And I understand it's funny, and I find it funny myself, but that is the disconnect that we're seeing between developers and data providers and stakeholders, because no one says that a stakeholder needs to be able to run Python code and understand what's written there on every line, right? That's not what the stakeholder, what the decision maker is ultimately there for. So we need to find a way to close this gap. The second thing that I wrote there was hybrid drought index development. And with hybrid drought index development, I mean a way to strengthen the buy-in from regional, national, local stakeholders in the actual index calibration, index design process. People know a lot about their own livelihoods. No one knows it better than themselves, right? So why would I exclude their knowledge from the design process of a drought risk finance index? The question is, how do you do that? The third point here is we've been collaborating very closely with the UN World Food Program in the context of a resilience building project. I worked in 4 or 5 African countries, West Africa and East Africa, and that worked really well. So we can do it on the micro scale. We can trigger payouts before losses are observed and before their impacts are perceived. So that's the micro scale. What's happening at the macro scale? There are many insurance pools. There are many regional, African, Caribbean insurance pools that work at the sovereign level. So governments are the counterpart for the insurer, and that works as well. What's happening in between? So that is something that we're right now learning, that we're right now exploring. What about mesoscale risk financing? What about the water utility sector? What about super expensive water tankers that need to be brought in as a last resort if there are no other sources of clean water? So that's the last slide. What can we do? We need to do a better job at translating buzzwords into reality. It's all machine learning, locally led, resilience driven. We need to think beyond individual projects. It does not help if I travel to any country for 3 days and I do a workshop and then I leave and no one sees me again. So that's exactly the opposite of building trust. I think that from a scientific perspective, we need to put a lot of emphasis on developing a new generation of climate data or science translators, people with 1 foot in science and 1 foot in applications. Climate change adaptation funding, that's a huge issue that would fill an entire hour. Just to say that a lot of funding goes into climate change mitigation, not enough goes into adaptation. The climate risk finance universe is hosted in the climate change adaptation sphere. The richest countries of this planet have pledged and have promised to allocate 100 billion per year for climate change adaptation measures, and that hasn't happened. And lastly, I think there's a lot of potential in more advanced methods. Everybody's talking about ChatGPT. I don't think that any automated AI service will solve the issues that we're facing right now, at least not at the moment, until HAL 9000 comes up. But the solution would, in that case, not be to say, we don't want any AI, or we just rely on AI. So that's basically what like in a formulated in a rather strange way, but that's what the US and what Europe are doing. Europe is over-regulating, and I think the US is not regulating enough. But there's a huge potential in the coming years, so happy to talk about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Stay here. Does anybody have a quick question for Marcus?
I'm residing in Pakistan, and from last 1 year, I'm noticing climate change in our country. As when our corn is, at the last stage for harvest, hailstorm occur and destroy everything. Similar happened recently when farmers were going to, harvest the wheat, but hailstorm struck it and all the fields were destroyed. Is it an indicator that we are heading towards the drought in coming years? Because at the end we are getting nothing. All the, you said that we should be prepared by these risk factors.
Do you want to summarize that? You summarize the question and then answer it.
Okay, so the way I understand your question is if there is how we understand climate trends in certain regions, right? First of all, we need to understand climate trends, and these climate trends might not be equally represented in the different variables, right? But from the perspective of statistical analysis, it makes sense to understand how these climate trends have evolved over the recent years or decades. Sometimes it's rather straightforward to correct them, right? Because if you don't correct them, we have seen that in Western Africa. We've seen that the overall rainfall amounts increased since the year 2000, which would mean more rainfall, lower insurance payouts. The problem was that the rainfall was distributed over fewer days and thereby not useful for agricultural production. So that's exactly the same narrative that needs to be replicated, and I believe it has been replicated for Pakistan. So that's the basis to build any kind of finance product, right? First understand what are the needs, what are the data, what are the stories hidden in the data, and then build a finance product on top of them.
Thank you, Marcus. And you can begin to see why finance is so important, but it has to be well grounded. So our last speaker is Roni Rimschwat, and we're coming home to Nebraska, and we're going to hear about groundwater trading and markets and how that can be part of new thinking on drought management and water management. Renata, sorry.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. So in today's session on solutions to drought, I am focusing on local water policy. So specifically, as Rachel said, I will be talking about groundwater transfers here in Nebraska. So water transfers or water markets are not a new tool used to address water variability. But what makes them unique in Nebraska is that they have been active for a long time. They're very different across Nebraska, and they are highly regulated, which is pretty uncommon, especially when it comes to groundwater management. And so given a growing interest in putting stronger restrictions for groundwater management and implementing more groundwater markets in different places globally, Nebraska seems to be a good place to study them. So I'll be sharing a few of the lessons that I've learned from studying them so far. But first, let me give you a little bit of context and tell you what's behind those groundwater transfers in Nebraska and why they are needed in the first place. So Nebraska has the most irrigated acres in the United States, about 9 million. And the majority of them, about 85%, are irrigated using groundwater. However, demand for irrigation water is not uniform across the state, right? So water availability varies comparing eastern portion of the state to the western portion of the state. And that highly depends on the annual rainfall, which, as you can see from this map, it can vary from less than 12 inches a year in the west in Nebraska to more than 30 inches in the southeastern portion of the state. And so this indicates, this means that different groundwater management tools and regulatory and non-regulatory tools are also more popular in the western portion of the state. However, when severe drought hits, like 2012 or last year's drought, which were pretty severe in this region, water managers and producers want to be more proactive want to be better prepared for the next time such a drought hits. So then flexible water management tools like transfers become more popular and more critical across the entire state. Groundwater in Nebraska is managed by 23 natural resources districts via elected boards of directors. They all have regulatory power, and they have a mandate to sustain groundwater for long term. And so to meet those groundwater sustainability goals, they have a variety of tools. So they impose groundwater, they require groundwater use reports and metering, impose moratoria on well drilling and irrigated acres, also enforce groundwater allocations, and design, regulate, and administer groundwater transfers. Are a popular idea because they provide flexibility by reallocating water to where and when it is most needed. So when water markets are carefully designed, they can move water from lower valued to higher valued uses, and without jeopardizing needs for different sectors, including environmental water needs. Careful water market designs also need to consider 3 different steps that are important for water rights sellers and buyers. And each of these steps need to be specific to local context, as well as consider different roles of stakeholders that are supporting farmers' decisions. So, for example, first of all, it would be important to consider economic basis. So, water rights sellers and buyers considering to enter a market need to understand the relative profitability associated with irrigated and non-irrigated land. After that, it is important to understand the enabling environment, so institutional framework. What are the laws, federal, state level, local level, underlying water regulation? What are the practices? Who can even hold water rights in this specific location? And also it is critical to understand administrative and physical transfer implementation processes in order to understand the full costs and also details associated with transfer execution. So we studied groundwater transfers in 7 natural resources districts. And let me just share a few findings to highlight their variability. There are 2 major types of groundwater transfers in Nebraska. So there are formal transfers, and they generally include a transfer of a property right. And locally, they are most often understood as a transfer of certified irrigated acres. Another type of water markets would be informal transfers. They do not include a transfer of a property right. By the way, informal transfers are also regulated in Nebraska, and there are multiple types of informal transfers. The most popular one is called pooling most of the time. Sometimes the language changes depending on the location where you are. And what it means is it indicates a joint operation of 2 or more irrigated tracts. Another type of informal transfers would be when a landowner is pumping groundwater onto a neighboring parcel. Usually that is under a different ownership. Administrative processes are simpler and cheaper for informal transfers, and they do not include analysis on the impact on streamflow depletion. Talking about the streamflow depletion, there are different environmental and conservation goals in Nebraska. And as a result, there are rules that account for that. So some districts, in addition to the mandate to guarantee long-term groundwater sustainability, they need to more carefully manage how groundwater pumping affects streamflow due to additional responsibilities coming from interstate compacts and endangered species programs. So for example, some districts require no net increase in streamflow depletion, while other districts require no net change in stream depletion. And their rules, transfer rules are designed to account for that. And so generally transfer rules locally, they depend on local hydrogeology and also depend on the transfer type, as I mentioned. The variability of transfer rules continues. They vary comparing transaction costs, transfer size, transfer frequency, so how active these markets are, as well as the language used to define and explain those transfers. And so it seems that all the rules are designed in a way so that they would make sense to local constituents. And I'm gonna be finishing here. I'm leaving you with 3 main highlights of my talk. But in terms of learning from groundwater transfers in Nebraska and applying that knowledge in other regions, I think the key is knowing local hydrogeology from the beginning. There's significant hydrologic complexity in Nebraska. And so water institutions evolved over time to meet that complexity. And locally administered and designed water markets is just one of those tools that are helping to provide flexibility and reduce risk. Thank you.
So Renata highlighted one way of dealing with drought. Where you don't have a drought and where you have drought within a state like this, you're able to trade and exchange water between different users and looking at the economic and environmental considerations that go into that. Does anybody have any questions for Renata? Yeah. So the question is groundwater managed conjunctively? So groundwater, surface water, are they managed separately or conjunctively?
Both. So there are natural resources districts that I mentioned, they manage only groundwater. Surface water and the state is managed at a state level by the Department of Natural Resources. However, these institutions, so these 23 natural resources districts and the Department of Natural Resources, they work together. So there are lots of integrated management plans to ensure how groundwater pumping affects stream flow, so to ensure no negative impact.
So thank you. So I'm now going to open up the questions. We've had we've talked questions at the specific level here. Are there any online questions? Would you like to ask those folks?
Yes, so the first question is for Mark. There's only half a question, but one part of that question is, what are the other potential and future, what's the potential for basically using AI in drought monitoring and impact mitigation?
So the question was, what's the potential for AI or ML for drought prediction and monitoring?
Yes.
So both fields are looking at that as a tool. Like any tool, it's not the one answer. I don't think it replaces expert judgment. Just in my opinion, I think you need both. So those should work in harmony because, again, when you come back to impacts and does that match reality on the ground, it has to be validated. All these processes that I talked about, I probably didn't emphasize it enough, was working with folks on the ground to validate it so that we know it's in the ballpark, that they trust it, and that our models or our CDIs or our machine learning or indicators are as accurate as we can make them with the science we have today. But that said, we want to look forward to maximizing that area to understand relationships between parameters in the future, and not just within the environmental parameters, but between the environmental and the vulnerability and risk parameters, crossing the aisles, so to speak.
Thank you, Mark.
So the second question is for you. Since droughts could affect so many different sectors, as you mentioned, the current action plan might only focus on the 5 top ones. I wonder if there are ways to improve it in the future.
So in the end, this was the first drought action plan that was developed, and we needed to make it actionable. And so in this group of across ministries, we came up with a top 5. We could have had the top 10, but it meant that each one of those responses then needed to have a set of actions, and what goes with that is budget and finance and ability to bring actions. So we would want the top 20. But in this first, it was a very pragmatic, practical approach, and it was agreed with the multi-ministerial team, that drought technical committee. These were the top priority sectors that top priority impacts that the drought action plan would address, and that's what we would want to respond to.
So the last question is for you. So the question is, I agree with your points about the socioeconomic data. I'm interested in your thoughts or suggestions on improving the quality or resolution of the socioeconomic data sets.
Okay, so what we're currently working on is sort of a synthesis of the different sources of information that are quality controlled, standardized, and harmonized and already out there. So that could include USAID, demographic and health survey data, humanitarian data, World Food Program, food insecurity data, to sort of triangulate all the sources of information that we have to close the gaps that we are currently facing. And in many cases, there will some gaps will remain, but everything is better than having just one data point or two throughout the year, right?
Did you have a question?
Yes, I do. First of all, this has been a great panel. I mean, there's been everything from, financial sort of gains around that, when there was a strike, to water markets and trigger points. One thing that I do find lacking, right, this is going to be a tricky one here, so that is the integration between refugee programs and drought programs. So you are seeing a lot of people fleeing from areas. I'm not sure, Rachel, have you been in that drought region, right? You see how many people that are moving. Have you, and this is a question for you, Rachel, have you considered integrating drought management plans and refugee programs?
It's what we did. So what we did was, in 2 of the countries, we did an explicit analysis of migration, both within the country and beyond the borders, and how much drought was part of the triggers of that. What we know is that drought are threat multipliers. They're risk multipliers. People don't often move because of drought. They move because they don't have access to employment or education or many other things like that, something like the internet or data, or that they're from the wrong caste or tribe, or that they're marginalized in a particular way. And what we see is drought is the last straw. So what we have been doing is trying to look at particularly those vulnerable communities, what is needed to help those communities stay. What is it that they need? It might be drought risk finance, but Marcus was, maybe it's an early payout of $500 that pays for the food for the next year and buys seeds and fertilizers and all that to allow people to stay. So we often, when we did those drought preparedness actions, but also drought mitigation actions, particularly looked at those vulnerable communities, and those are the ones that tend to migrate. Drought doesn't impact everybody equally. So we do look at that. There is an increasing, we have to get a little bit beyond the rhetoric of climate change. Climate change is going to bring hordes of migrants into Europe or wherever it might be. It's more complicated and more nuanced than that. But that doesn't mean to say that when we're developing our drought action plans, we shouldn't be looking at those particular trigger points and learning from the past what has brought migration. So those that are dealing with, those ministries that are often dealing with agriculture, ministries of water, they often don't deal with migration. So it would be good to be able to include that, but it's trying to make sure that what we're doing is responding to the drought, which isn't necessarily the same as responding to the reason to migrate. Yes, please do. Anybody answer that one?
So the bottom line is we're really trying everything we can so people can stay and don't become migrants, right?
That's the tricky point.
Yeah, yeah. So,
And you actually
yeah.
I was just testing, right? Thank you.
The tricky part is that, I mean, of course, once farmers start selling their livestock, that's a very, very critical sign that their lively conditions have been deteriorated up to a point that is become absolutely critical. The problem that I see in the area of displacement migration is that in any international crisis, you have many players involved with their own mandates, and many of these mandates are contradicting, right? And in the case of migration, you have IOM, but you also have IDMC. You have different players that try to, I shouldn't say that out loud, but ultimately it's about labeling people as migrants or refugees, right? Because that's where the funding comes from, right? And then it becomes very, very complicated very quickly. So it's not only the climate story, it's not only the country's own struggle at the governmental level, but it's international organizations that are naturally like struggling as well.
Hi, one last question. So it's a great question that maybe in some societies it's thinking that the drought is God's will. And therefore, how do we then bring in drought action plans or monitoring and all of that to help people that are impacted by that drought, whatever the cause of that is? Who's going to take that? Mark?
I'll give a real brief, because we deal with that here too with indigenous folks. I mean, that word is almost forbidden. So we try to use another hook. What is the way in? Is it extreme event? Is it dealing with it in the scope of other things and not just calling it drought? Typically, that's my experience here. Elsewhere, including in Tanzania, we've had folks to these meetings, and I've heard that in our work in Southern Africa. And so again, it's always come down to context of semantics. So we're not using, we might not use that word, but we're showing hopefully information that's useful and usable for decision makers to enact into their daily work to help be more proactive. That doesn't mean it always works, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's still a tough sell. It's a very tough sell. Human nature is to stick the head in the sand until you have to deal with whatever it is, whether it's a flood or a drought or a typhoon or an earthquake. That's that hydrological cycle that Daniel showed. So that cultural taboo thing is definitely something to keep in consideration when working with folks on the ground. Thank you.
Daniel, would you want to finish off?
I just want to say also a few things. First of all, I think we can treat drought, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. An opportunity because the drought that strikes Tanzania is likely going to also strike Kenya and also other neighboring countries. So it is an opportunity for coordinating, communicating, and working together. The other thing is, of course, it can people can understand it as a God's will, but we need to also look into appreciating the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous experience that they have been, how have they been tackling it, and trying to adopt this, trying to make sure that the technology, the capacity development builds on their existing knowledge. So changing the attitude, changing the perspective it's not easy, but at least making sure that we start with what they know, with what they have been doing, is what I would say, maybe taking the positive narrative of it. Thank you.
One last thing. The one thing I forgot to say is the other thing is that the connotation is that drought is always negative. In the game of impacts, there are winners as well. right? In different sectors. There can be winners and not just it's all doom and gloom. So I think that's important to keep in mind. When we monitor impacts, we do see some positive economic benefit for particular sectors, whether it's transportation or construction or viticulture, or the list is pretty good. And so it comes back to timing of droughts, days between rain events, intensity of the events. These things we see changing. They see that. They're sort of adapting for a change in a growing season, perhaps. So these are different ways to sell that story without actually calling it drought.
So I am going to have to pull this session to an end. I want to first of all say thank you to you for joining us. There's lots of really good sessions going on here, so thank you for spending that time with us here, an hour and a half with us here. And what we've looked at is we've gone from global through to water rights trading here in Nebraska to look at the many positive solutions and ideas and work that's going on there to tackle drought. We have to do this together. We have to bring all our knowledges together. And what I would welcome, or all of us would welcome, is if you see us in the corridors or in the thing, and you've got ideas or experiences or insight that you want us to take to that next big drought conference in January 2024, tell us, what are your experiences? What aren't we covering? What do you need to be covered? And I know for me, one of the things that we don't talk about is the ecological impact of drought or the social justice that goes with drought. So there's lots of things that weren't in that first iteration of drought management. So talk to us, tell us your thoughts, and we will take that to that next conference. So thank you very much for everybody being part of this. Thank you.